Today I'm going to be critiquing one of our subscribers' tattoos. It's a Chicano realism piece. And bro, I hate to break it to you, you fell into one of the biggest traps when it comes to beginners doing realism. But don't stress, because today I'm going to show you 3 things that you can do to absolutely bring this portrait to life. Now, even if this isn't your tattoo, you still want to stick around and keep watching, because if you're trying realism and it just keeps looking flat, chances are you're running into the same issues. Huge shout out to the volunteer that sent in this tattoo and gave us the green light to go ahead and roast this piece. And by the way, if you'd like to see some of your own work in these videos, make sure that you submit a picture of one of your fake skin tattoos. There's a link to a form down in the description below this video. I'm going to be scoring this tattoo on 4 different things: contrast, saturation, smoothness of shading, and also readability. Now, if I could only fix one thing in this piece, it's most definitely going to be the hard lines that are kind of just making this piece super, super flat. Realism does not have lines. Anytime that you put a bunch of line work in realism, you're screaming that this design is flat, and you lose that 3D effect pretty much straight away. When you look at realistic objects like this silicone hand that I had randomly lying around, your brain just sees lights and shadows. They don't see lines. As soon as you put lines in there, that's something that's not there in real life, your brain's just going to interpret that as flat. So when you're doing realism, instead of marking out in really hard lines where, you know, the outer edges of your tones are going to go, you want to just use shading to create darker values that show shape. So particularly in the lips, right? So you can see how I'm just taking away these really hard lines, softening those up, and then instead of having those really, really hard lines, we just imply the shape with actual tones. With this lip, we want the bottom part to come in just a little bit. You want it to be nice and dark at the corners. So I'm going to bring that shading up just a little bit. And then we also want to bring that shading just above the bottom part of the lip here as well. We want this to have a fairly hard edge. And this is just going to give it the illusion that the lip is kind of tucking in and it's going in towards the teeth. Then we're going to make this a little bit darker still. You can see how we just got like a darker value because the top lip is hidden from the light. And the light's coming down because it's underneath that bit of skin at the front of the mouth. It's always going to be a little bit darker, whereas the bottom lip, that's going to catch the light. So for the bottom lip, we actually want to do that quite bright, and we use the shadow that it casts underneath the lip on the chin to give it that nice contrast. So once you've got like those 2 little bits of shading, you'll add just those little lines, and you want the start and the end of those lines to be concealed beneath those 2 little parts of shading that you've just done. You have a slightly lighter shade up the top, and then those lines will just give you the textured kind of creased look that you see in lips. You just want to make sure that you really take the time to get those in nice and smooth. For the bottom lip, we want to brighten this up just a bit. It's not as dark as it is in the original tattoo. And then we add a little bit of shading just on the side, again, just to give it some volume. And then where most of the black is actually going to go is in the shadow. So you can see how the shadow underneath the lip, we probably want to even make that lip a little bit smaller. And then now that we've got that, we just add a little bit of shading on the top, same as before, but just not as much because this is catching the light. A little bit of shading on the bottom. You see how in the reference, we've got like those little lines or those little creases on the lips. And I do this with a 3-round liner or a 5-round liner, depending on how big the tattoo is. By adding those tiny little creases in, you add all those little textured parts in. And instead of doing them individually, when you approach it in like a system, you do the bottom row of shading, the top row of shading, then just the lines where the start and finish get concealed between the 2 tones or the 2 gradients. Then you get a really nice, realistic look on the lips. Cool, and then when we go to the nose, again, you can see you got like a really hard outline on the very edge. We just want to soften that up, get rid of that, and then just rely on our tones to define all of the edges for us. So for example, for the bottom, typically we want to have that substantially darker than the top. Cool, so you can see how like the bottom half of the nose, we've just added those shadows, and straight away it looks more 3D. You can see like the bottom part of the nose versus the top. It's a very different tonal separation. And what we can also do, if we add more shading in the eye socket, then again, that's going to help us define that edge that we've got just here. And again, help us give it more form. We want to go super light when we're going over the eyelid because that kind of is more raised. And you can see now we've basically taken out all the lines, but it still looks like a very 3D shape without any lines. By using values instead of lines, we create solid edges and we give the shapes their form. So what does this actually look like in practice? I actually did a variation of this tattoo design on a call example with some of our students. And you can see the difference. If you look at the lips, there's no hard line around the very edges. It's just very brushed in with a light gray wash. You've got those nice little creases all throughout the lips, which gives it that nice texture. And you can see on the nose, again, there's no hard line holding anything in. It's just edges and shades. And you can just tell it looks a lot softer. It looks a lot more realistic, and there's no hard lines on it that just flatten out the entire piece. The next big fix that I'll do is by adding black shading under the highlights in the eyes. Now, the eyes are a very important part of the portrait. They either make it look alive or dead. And right here, we can see this little reflector in the eyes, but it's just a little circle. It looks flat. There's no contrast around it. So it looks like she's kind of been awake for 72 hours, maybe on a bit of a bender, maybe doing some drugs. So you add that little bit of shading just next to that eye. You're gonna get a much more realistic look by adding in just a lot more black. Now that's going to give it a lot more depth. Even if it blends into like the eyeliner on top, that's totally fine. Thicken up these eyelashes towards the base too. When you're tattooing this, right, if I'm gonna be doing the eyes on a portrait, I'm not really worried about using a mag. I'm gonna be using a 3 liner, depending on the size, sometimes even a 1 round liner if the portrait's quite small. And I'll do all of this shading with a 3 liner. I don't really get the mag out unless it's a very, very big portrait, like on a back or something like that. But I'll just use that 3 liner because it's so small. Even when you just brush that needle in and you cross hatch it enough, you'll still be able to get it nice and smooth, even though it's a liner and not a mag needle. And you can see the difference when you have that depth in the eye. It's a lot more lifelike. You get like an actual real person instead of just like a zombified drawing of a person. The third fix that I would do is going to be definitely the hair. This is the hardest part of doing realistic portraits, is by far getting the hair texture right. But there is an easy way to do it. I know that this design was actually pulled from like an existing design. It's like an appropriation of that. You can do that, but you'll never quite get the quality as good as if you go off like an actual realistic image for a reference when you're doing realism. So what I did when I created this tattoo, you'll see it's basically the same tattoo. One of them just looks a lot more realistic. So the way that I did that was I took this original tattoo from the student and I put it into Nano Banana and I said, hey, create a realistic digital artwork based on this tattoo. And then it just turned that tattoo into a realistic face. And then that's the reference that I used for my tattoo. And when I stenciled it, I used an app called Stencil AI that did the entire stencil for me. So I didn't have to worry about doing the individual tiny little lines. So you can see when I've got this stencil here, right? When I'm doing the hair, I always look for those little V-shaped channels. I start off with a 3 round liner or a 5 round liner, depending on the size of the tattoo. And I come in and I look at all these stencil lines and I look for these little V-shaped channels where I can create depth and I can create my darkest lines. And I'm like, okay, where else can I find these? I've got some more just here. And we put these little V-shaped channels, and then this is going to form the details of our hair. And we can see that we've got another little line section here. So I'm gonna make this even darker. I'm gonna do this solid black because she's kind of like a Latina. She's got like dark hair. I want overall the hair to be quite dark. So I'm gonna be putting a lot of solid black in it. And then for the lightest parts, I'm gonna brush over that entirely with like a lighter wash. And we've got a big wide open space here. So I do all of that in solid black. And that's how we create the different layers and the different textures of hair. So rather than tattoo the individual strands of hair, I'm looking for the shadows between each strand of hair. And then once I've got all those little individual lines in, those are my details. And then I just put the volumes over the top. So then I get a bigger brush and then I put the blacks in to hide the beginning and the ends of those lines. So now it looks like I've got some really nice hard edges and some really soft tones over the top. And I just shade over those parts that I put in with a liner. And that's what gives me the illusion of all these different little strands of hair. And you can put different tones in there to add more or less depth in. And then to make it nice and dark, you just put a very light wash over the very top. So then there's no skin tone, there's just a slight gray tint to the entire head. And then that's how you do hair the easy way, but it all comes from having a really good stencil. Now, if you compare that to what we see in the original, like I said, they're on the right track, but they've just put the lines in. They haven't built up the tones and the shading to conceal those lines, the beginnings and the edges of those lines. You can kind of see it in the eyebrows as well. They've just done like individual lines like that. When you're doing eyebrows on a tattoo, use the side of the mag and then brush the very sides of those mags to get the individual hairs within the eyebrows. It's gonna look much, much more realistic. It's gonna have a much more delicate, finer effect than just doing fat lines through those eyebrows with a liner. You gotta remember too, it's not just this tattoo specifically. I see this with almost every beginner that approaches realism. They use the lines to kind of give structure to the tattoo, and when you take those lines away, they don't know where to shade the piece, okay? Especially with hair. I shade it just like any other 3D shape. If we're looking at the stencil, I know that I've got my volumes or my big chunks of hair, and you can see how I'm just finding the individual shapes within the hair. I get all my locks, I get the light bits, the dark bits, and then the individual V-shapes that I talked about earlier, or the lines in between, they're just the details. And you can even see now when I'm putting these black in, so it hides the beginning and the end of some of these stencil lines. You can see straight away how you just add a little bit of shading to that, the hair starts to appear. So think of each lock of hair as an individual shape. Don't worry necessarily about tattooing individual strands. You want to tattoo the shadows or the parts in between the strands of hair, and then the negative spaces are the actual strands of hair. Once you put in those details in, again, just following that stencil, and then you get those really nice textured locks of hair throughout the face. Now, for the subscriber who submitted this tattoo for me to roast today, if you resubmit this piece with all the fixes that I've implemented, I'm happy to take a look at the update and give you some feedback. And if you're following along at home and you're also finding that you're putting a lot of lines in your realistic pieces and it's just making them look terrible, I've got a banger drill that's gonna help you out. It's just a sheet of shapes and other 3D objects that force you to use values instead of lines to get your nice edges within those pieces. I'll put a link to it in the description just down below this video. And if you want some feedback on your own work like this every single week with clear and actionable advice you can take to get better every single week, then the link to private coaching is in the description just down below this video. Now, we're going to be making more of these critique style videos every single week, so make sure that you smash that like and subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Until then, you can watch our last critique just here, where I walk through this new school design and explain exactly how to make sure that you have enough contrast in your tattoos, as well as the most important rules for adding highlights. I'll see you guys in the next one.